What if I told you there never was a Big Six? What if I said the reason we celebrate these men is an image carefully crafted long ago to give legitimacy place in our history, not by merit, but stolen, killed for in a never-ending sense of entitlement and a self-serving need to undermine our sovereignty for a calculating grab at power? What if I told you the image exists to legitimize an elitist minority that were long ago rejected? This is a story about how our entire history is being rewritten by the side that lost, and how in the 21st century, that lie is slowly becoming our only memory of the past. Let's start from the beginning. 1948, Gold Coast veterans of World War II have returned home. They have received only a third of the compensation they were owed for sacrificing their lives, same as everyone else, except not for some notion of a free world. Of course not. They are the subjects of the largest colonial empire in the war, and indeed the largest colonial empire the world has ever seen, the United Kingdom. No, they went off to die for another man's agenda, because as subjects of the Gold Coast colony, they have to. Now the ones who sent them there say they won't pay what they promised them. Depending on which history you read, these men were drunk out of their minds when they decided to present their petition to the colonial office. The narrative, however, that has survived despite that fury is that veterans marched peacefully to the seat of colonial power to hand their petition to the governor. The governor refused to see them and sent British soldiers to block the advance at the Osu Castle Road. The veterans meet these former brothers in arms at about 200 meters. This is what happens.
The crowd in front were very close, perhaps 20, 25 yards, I don't know. I gave the order to fire, and nothing happened at all. We were obviously going to get overrun at any moment, and I retreated back onto the firing party and tore a rifle out of the hands of one of the men, and I myself fired at a man in front who was urging the crowd forward. And he was killed, and I think I fired a total of another 5 shots. And the crowd turned around and made off.
Shortly after the confrontation, riots break out across Accra and across the entire colony. But who is to blame? Some believe it is these men. But is it true? These men, most of them direct benefactors of indirect rule, the system the British used and the West still uses, indoctrinate the African leader with Western education, get him a comfortable lifestyle, a Western lifestyle, raise him above his peers, and he will sell his nation's future. Promise them money, gold, shiny objects, educate his children, and you can perpetuate an oppressor class serving on your behalf in a foreign land. This was the basis of indirect rule, the system the British used to control their African domain. Some of the Big Six were royalty. Under colonialism, that was the equivalent of the house Negro, or Uncle Tom, who will trade the freedom, sovereignty, and security of an entire nation for creature comforts. And this is precisely what happened. Immediately after World War II, much of the British colonies across the world began agitating for independence, except Africa. The reason was because those who claimed to be activists for freedom were in fact comfortable, well-fed, well-positioned elites. They put on a show, but were in no hurry to rush the matter until they could maneuver to have themselves as Lord Supreme over their fellow black. After all, they felt more kindred with the white colonial master than the working-class black person. Whatever timetable the British had was fine by them. They just needed to keep the conversation going, so they wouldn't be forgotten when the good times rolled. Except for one. Kwame Nkrumah came from a humbler background than the other members of the so-called Big Six. You can say Kwame Nkrumah was a self-made man. More importantly, his reality represented the average Ghanaian more closely. Educated, his activities in the United States where he schooled showed an imperviousness to indoctrination about himself and about black power. For a man like Kwame Nkrumah, independence took on the necessary urgency it demanded. Like a true African leader, he was in touch with the pulse of the everyman. When arrested, William Oforiatta, or Pa Willie he was affectionately called, had this to say.
We were not expecting to be arrested, but we were arrested, and we didn't actually weren't very angry because they came and said, well, we don't really know whether you are the cause of it, but your presence here does not seem to conduce to peace, so we'll take you away.
How diplomatic. And that's because it was found out almost immediately that Kwame Nkrumah was the only one actually responsible for channeling the resentment following the shooting at Osu Castle Crossroad into colony-wide riots. Well, that's what the British and the colonial sympathizers call it, riots. Let's call it what it was. National revolt. And everyone knows oppressors fear revolution. Oppressors prefer a long-suffering oppressed people to be docile, accepting of their fate for any manner of abuse. Only true leaders cultivate a defiance in their own people, because a true leader knows defiance can be channeled into agency. Defiant people are the only true system that keeps leaders in check. Oppressors fear revolution so much that whereas the efforts of the elites of the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC, had resulted in absolutely no gain whatsoever up until the time of the 1948 disturbance, the day of unrest allowed the moderates in the British Parliament to pressure their conservative government to rethink self-rule in favor of the African natives. This would never have happened under UGCC, whose vague slogan of self-rule in the shortest possible time begs the question, when is the shortest possible time? When the British recovered from their economic debt following World War II and began to reassert their colonial might? When the Gold Coast becomes an anglicized version of Francophrique, colonization in all but name? Independence was never guaranteed. And now, due to the resistance of a few, it would have to be fought for. Nkrumah broke away from the UGCC to form the Convention People's Party, the CPP. Their mantra was self-government now. Nkrumah's view on the matter were adapted from a quote by Thomas Jefferson, "We prefer self-governance in danger than servitude in tranquility." Words that ring just as true today as they did in 1950. If there's a need for any further evidence that we never had a Big Six, is the fact that when the British government decided to include Africans in their government, they set up the Kuse Committee, which, well, the history books are a bit vague on the matter, but suffice to say, consisted of 5 of the so-called Big Six. The excluded person was Kwame Nkrumah, the one person who actively wanted independence. The other 5 were seen as moderate and intellectuals by the colonial British, people who could be made to compromise, to make deals for their sake to favor a British agenda. Nkrumah, by their assessment, was a hardliner, a radical, a rabble-rouser. No use for such a man when the name of the game was go slow. So the British organized an election, with the main contender being the UGCC and Nkrumah CPP. Prior to the election, Nkrumah had organized positive action, for which he was again behind bars. The colonial government's plan was to guarantee an easy victory for UGCC over the CPP. But thanks to the brilliant organization skills of Birima, sincerity and genuine popularity of Kwame Nkrumah, the common man rejected the elitist UGCC in favor of the prison graduates, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and his CPP. The first ever government to include blacks, elected by the people, not imposed by the British, was Nkrumah's CPP, which the colonial government gradually accepted in 1951. It would be in this election that the term veranda boys would be coined.
They were prepared to sleep on verandas with the boys, popularly called veranda boys, because most of them were sleeping in verandas at the time. And when they went out to the villages, they trucked down together, sang their songs, drank palm wine in street bars, street corners with them, and virtually were prepared to throw their lot in with them at all times, at all places. Now this, Dankwa and others were not prepared to do. No, indeed, would they have been proved honest if they had attempted to do it, because it just didn't suit them. It wasn't in their character, it wasn't in their makeup, and they could not pretend to be with them in those directions without exposing their own hypocrisy.
Final election for the full government was to be in 1954, which the CPP again won with ease. The UGCC could no longer exist because there was no more Gold Coast. The name decided for the new country was Ghana, named after the first great African state. But here's where it gets interesting. Right about the time between 1954 and 1956, certain members of the UGCC showed their hand. They decided more important to them than independence was ethnic superiority. You see, members of the Asante Kingdom, which only 50 years earlier was still a force to reckon with, decided that they didn't want to be unequally yoked to their African former subjects, people who they decided were not their co-equals. They wanted a federal system in which they could keep their wealth from the grabby hands from an inferior African government. And they were willing to not only run back to the British to stop independence, to make their case, but they were willing to kill in order to force the issue. It was not uncommon for members of the CPP or people viewed to be on the side of Nkrumah's government to be violently attacked by the separatists, who called themselves the National Liberation Movement, or NLM. Busia, Ghana's Western-approved Prime Minister from 1969, the second person in the Dankwa Busia Dombo tradition, was a member of these violent separatists. In an interesting lack of sense of history, the Northern Territories, who had suffered hardest under the slave trade, with the Asantes had the largest part in, fearing Northern Ghana would be left underdeveloped under a black Ghanaian leader, decided to ally themselves in the separatist NLM. The mindset of colonialism, the same which made the Fante chiefs sign off their freedom in the Bond of 1844, would now rear its head once more, to see Africans so mentally servile that they would choose known white oppressors over African brothers who actually wished for their freedom.
So we sent a delegation to Bridging, and I spoke for the Northern Territories. And I told them that when the chiefs of the Northern Territories entered into treaties for protection with the British Crown, they understood it to mean not only protection from internal and external threats, but also a responsibility on the part of the British Crown to lead the people, to stand on their feet and be able to manage their own affairs. Now, we felt Britain had not honorably played her part in that aspect. And I told them that, well, when the first British men came to our place, they told our fathers to look to them, and that they were going to lead them step by step into a prosperous and happy country. And they believed them and felt the white man never lied. I used that expression. I said, they believed the white man never lied, but it appears you are going back on your word, which means you are not going to lie to them to use that word. So I thought Britain had a moral obligation, to help us out of our present difficulty.
Even the governor couldn't go to Kumasi without threat of force visited upon him from the NLM. The British informed Nkrumah that there would be need for a referendum to decide if independent Ghana would become a united country or a federal state divided across ethnic lines. The argument was that, with the violence as it was, they couldn't grant Ghana independence just yet, lest she explode into civil war. Something which federal Nigeria would do in the Biafran War. So full independence was again suspended. The struggle had to continue for 2 more years. Finally, Nkrumah's CPP won against the NLM with enough seats in parliament to abolish the possibility of any party founded on tribal, religious or other separatist lines, ensuring a united Ghana would be in a position to set the stage for the vision of a united Africa. Parliament will again turn to a legal use of referendum after Ghana became a republic, and Ghanaians voted for a one-party state, free of violent partisan strife. But that's a story for another time. As the national anthem played officially for the first time on 6th March 1957, Kwame Nkrumah, barely able to hide his tears, knew all too well how hard he had to fight. Yet even he couldn't have foreseen how insidious the elitist reactionary truly were, how far the Western assets in his midst will go to undermine Ghana's sovereignty, and for how long Ghana would have to struggle to root out prejudice centered on ethnicity, class, and privilege. Nkrumah would not live to see a truly free Ghana. He would die in exile, in Conakry. His years as leader plagued by would-be assassins, Western spies and reactionaries. The CPP would be toppled in a right-leaning coup d'etat by Western agents Kotoka, Afrifra and Ankara, aided by British, France and the United States of America. And despite the perpetrators making the argument for the coup being one to re-establish democracy, the CPP would be banned from standing for election until the early 1990s. However, on 6th March 1957, We were independent of Britain, yes, but did we know we were free? Had we truly thrown off oppressors' rule, or would history be once again rewritten to make heroes appear as villains and reactionaries appear as democrats? This is not a celebratory video. The battle is not won. Our struggle continues. This is a video to remind us all, to ask ourselves, which kind of African are we? There is a reason this fiction of the Big Six perpetuates itself. So that everything named after real heroes is renamed after the intellectual elites that continue to undermine our sovereignty under the guise of Western-mandated multi-party democracy. The lie sticks because a confident trickster can only ever hope to deceive a willing mark. Until we wake up and educate ourselves about certain hard truths, and until we remain woken this time, so we can stand defiantly against an oppressor's rule, our destiny will slip through our fingers. Ghana is a tale of two cities, split between those who prefer she remains divided by class, privilege, and ethnicity, and the rest of us, who owe a debt to those who came before us. We owe it to them, if not ourselves, to be educated about who we are, to understand why we must boldly, even in danger, struggle on, to guarantee our destiny of a truly free Africa, fought for and died for by true African leaders, becomes a reality in our lifetime. We do this so we honor our heroes, who at great risk to themselves show the African black, at least for a while, what freedom, true freedom, looks like.